Elias Carter had lived most of his life in silence, but the silence breaking that morning felt different, sharp, heavy, and dangerous. As the sun lifted over the dry hills, he sensed riders before he heard them, a gut feeling shaped by years of pain he never spoke about. When the gang finally appeared on the ridge, dust curling behind their horses, he didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood in his doorway, calm but haunted. The men circling his ranch thought he was an easy target, a lonely rancher with no allies, no family, no chance. But none of them knew the truth he carried like a scar beneath his ribs. None of them knew why he carved a strange Cherokee mark into the wood of his door. And in a few moments, when their leader's eyes landed on that mark, everything they believed about Elias would collapse in fear. Elias Carter was known in the nearby town as the man who spoke little, worked alone, and kept his distance from anything that smelled like trouble. But people never understood that his silence was not weakness, it was protection. He lived in a small cabin at the edge of the valley, where the wind carried the memories he tried so hard to bury. Every night he sat by the dim fire, staring at the carved Cherokee mark on his door, the only reminder of the family that once saved his life and then vanished into war. To others it looked like nothing, just an old symbol scratched into wood. But to Elias, it was a promise he made when he was barely old enough to hold a knife. And on the morning the gang arrived, that promise began to burn inside him again, warning him that his quiet life was coming to an end. Elias felt a shift in the air before the first hoof struck the dry earth, a low tremor rolling through the valley as if the land itself was warning him, and he stepped away from the fading warmth of his cabin fire, knowing his quiet world was about to crack. The morning light had barely settled when he caught the shapes of riders moving along the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky, spreading out with calculated hunger, the kind only men with empty hearts carried. He didn't move back, didn't hide, didn't reach for anything inside, because he understood men like them more than he wished to admit. They hunted the ones who seemed alone. The gang descended slowly, their horses kicking dust that coated the air in a thin brown veil, and their voices began rising, harsh and mocking, swelling with the excitement of believing they had found an easy prize. Elias remained still in the open doorway, every muscle locked in a steady calm that came from years of swallowing fear. And the gang's confidence only grew when they saw no weapon in his hand, no partner by his side, nothing that suggested he had anything to fight for. Their leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, nudged his horse forward and circled closer, studying Elias the way a wolf studies a wounded deer. But something in Elias's expression made him hesitate, a tiny slip in his practiced cruelty. Elias saw the hesitation but didn't speak, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle the men who expected him to beg or bargain. And instead he held their stares with a quiet strength that didn't match the worn clothes on his back. The riders fanned out, tightening their formation, and one of them called out a threat that echoed across the ranch. Yet Elias didn't flinch, because he felt the familiar heat building in his chest, the same heat he carried since the night everything in his life changed. The leader dismounted, dust rising around his boots as he walked toward the porch, and he smirked as if this moment already belonged to him. But Elias's steady gaze made that smirk flicker for a heartbeat. The man stepped onto the first wooden plank, and that was when his eyes caught at the carved mark on the door, the one Elias had traced with his fingertips the night before, as if whispering to ghosts he still missed. The leader's movement froze, his breath catching in a way his men immediately noticed, and the noise around them faded as he stared at the mark with a recognition that turned his confidence into something colder. Elias watched the shift ripple through him, watched fear slip into the man's posture like a shadow, and though he said nothing, his silence carried a weight that belonged to the legacy carved into that door. The wind pushed through the valley again, lifting dust around them, and Elias knew the moment had finally come when the past he tried to leave behind would reveal itself without him speaking a single word. The leader's breath tightened as he stared at the carved symbol, and for a long moment he didn't move, forcing his men to shift uneasily behind him while Elias watched with the same calm that had carried him through every hardship he never spoke about, letting the silence thicken until it felt like the entire valley was holding its breath. The leader tried to mask the fear creeping into his expression, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him, and when he finally stepped back from the porch, his boots scraped against the dry wood as if he had touched something forbidden. Elias didn't step forward or speak, Instead, he let his presence remain still and steady, the way a storm waits before breaking. And that quiet strength pushed the gang deeper into confusion. One rider whispered to another, trying to understand why their fearless leader suddenly looked sacking, and the sound of their muttering traveled through the dust-filled air, growing sharper as panic began to cut through their earlier confidence. The leader forced himself to straighten, trying to reclaim authority, but the mark burned in his mind like an old warning. And they called in tea? Ignore the stories he once heard as a boy's stories about the people who used that symbol. Stories whispered in fear around dying campfires. Elias saw the man struggle, saw him try to break the gaze that seemed to hold him in place. But the truth had already slipped into the leader's bones, cold and undeniable. The wind lifted again, brushing Elias's coat as he finally stepped onto the porch, not with aggression but with a quiet resolve that made the ground feel unsteady beneath the gang's feet. The leader raised a hand instinctively, as if to shield himself from a force he couldn't define, and Elias paused, his voice finally breaking the silence with a low tone that carried more weight than a shout. He told the man to leave while he still had the choice, and the words seemed to echo from the hills, steady and unwavering, shaking the riders who had arrived, believing they would take whatever they wanted without resistance. The leader tried to respond, but his voice cracked, and when he saw his men watching him with uncertainty, he swallowed hard, knowing he had to act before doubt destroyed what little power he still held. He stepped back toward his horse, trying to appear in control, yet every step betrayed the fear that had rooted inside him the moment he recognized the symbol carved into the door. Elias remained still, eyes steady, posture unbroken, and in that moment he looked less like a simple rancher, and more like someone shaped by something far older and stronger than any gang. The riders shifted anxiously, their hands tightening on reins, their earlier arrogance dissolving as the air thickened with attention. Nanama understood. The leader mounted his horse with a shaky breath, forcing his voice to rise above the growing uncertainty, and though he tried to mask the tremble in his command, everyone heard it clearly as he ordered his men to prepare themselves for whatever truth they had just awakened. Asterisk, the leader steadied himself in the saddle, but the tension inside him twisted tighter when Elias took one slow step forward, not threatening, simply existing with a presence that felt heavier than the moment itself, and the riders sensed it instantly as their horses shifted nervously beneath them. A younger gang member tried to speak, his voice thin with confusion, asking why they were hesitating over a quiet rancher. Yet the leader snapped at him with a sharp glance, not out of anger, but fear. Fear of the stories he never expected to face in daylight. Elias didn't respond to their whispers. Instead, he raised his hand and brushed his fingers lightly across the carved mark on the door, a quiet motion that carried more meaning than any weapon could, and the riders felt the weight of it settle in the air. The leader's breath faltered as a memory returned to him, a night long ago when an elder warned him never to cross paths with anyone who carried that symbol, because it represented a legacy that protected without boasting and fought only when the land or its people were threatened. Elias saw the shift in the leader's eyes, the recognition that melted into. The sun climbed higher, painting the valley in an unforgiving light, and the gang found themselves shrinking beneath it, unable to hold on to their earlier arrogance as the truth of who they were facing settled into their bones. The leader tried to rally his voice, but it cracked again, and the fragile echo of it only deepened the unease spreading through his group. Elias didn't need to raise his tone. His quiet posture carried all the warning they needed, and as the wind brushed past, the riders felt the weight of a legacy they had never been prepared to confront. Elias watched the leader's struggle deepen, and after a long breath, he let the truth rise inside him, a truth he had buried for years, then stepped fully into the open where the light touched the edges of his worn coat and revealed a quiet strength shaped by a life far harsher than anyone around him understood, and the riders leaned forward as if some unseen force compelled them to listen. His voice came low at first, steady yet laced with memories he never wanted to face again, as he told them he was not born into the symbol carved on his door, but was taken in by the people who carried it with honor long before he learned how to speak their language or walk without fear. The gang shifted uneasily, their faces tightening, as Elias described the night he was found half-conscious near a riverbank, where everything familiar had been taken from him, and how a Cherokee elder had lifted him from the cold ground, wrapped him in a blanket, and given him a second life he never expected. The leader's jaw clenched as he listened, not out of anger, but because the weight of those words clashed with everything he assumed about the silent rancher standing before him. And Elias continued, explaining how he had grown under the guidance of warriors who taught him that strength was not shown through shouting or violence, but through restraint, loyalty, and a promise to protect those who could not defend themselves. The riders felt the air change as he spoke, not because he threatened them, but because every word carried the echo of an old legacy that didn't need force to be believed. And the younger men looked at each other with nervous uncertainty, wondering how they had misjudged him so badly. Elias's voice gained a quiet power when he told them the mark on his door was not a warning, but a vow he made to honor the people who saved him when no one else cared, a vow carved with his own hand after the last elder who raised him passed during a harsh winter, leaving him with teachings that shaped every step he took. The leader's grip on the reins weakened, his confidence draining as he realized Elias didn't stand alone at all. He stood with decades of wisdom and the memory of a family who never needed to prove themselves with fear. Elias paused, letting the wind move between them, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and grief, and the riders felt something unfamiliar, respect for a man they had approached with cruel intentions. The leader tried to steady himself, but the truth Elias revealed pressed against him like a weight he couldn't escape, forcing him to confront the possibility that the quiet rancher in front of him possessed a strength far greater than anything his gang had faced. The valley remained silent, holding his words in the air, and every rider sensed that the story they had just heard was only the beginning of a truth they were never meant to challenge. The valley stayed painfully quiet after Elias's last words, and the silence pressed against the riders until their nerves began to fray, making even the strongest among them shift in their saddles, as if the ground beneath their horses had suddenly turned unsteady. And the leader felt the weight of every breath as he realized he no longer stood before a simple rancher, but a man shaped by a legacy older and stronger than anything he carried. One of the younger riders tried to lift his chin, forcing a show of courage, yet his voice cracked when he asked whether the stories about the people tied to that mark were true, and the leader silenced him with a trembling gesture, unwilling to hear the answer spoken aloud. Elias didn't raise his tone or move forward. Instead, he let the truth settle naturally, and his calm presence began unraveling the false bravado the gang had clung to since the moment they approached his land. The leader's horse jerked slightly, sensing his fear, and he gripped the reins tightly to steady himself, but every heartbeat reminded him of the tales told by elders who warned never to harm anyone connected to that symbol, because doing so meant inviting consequences far beyond human understanding. Elias watched him with quiet certainty, neither hostile nor afraid, and the steadiness in his eyes struck the riders harder than any weapon could, forcing them to see the difference between arrogance and real strength. A gust of wind swept across the valley, carrying dust that stung the riders' eyes, and for a moment they looked like men who had wandered into a storm without realizing it, until they were already too deep to escape cleanly. The leader tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. So he swallowed the tight knot of fear and finally muttered that he didn't want trouble, though the apology he attempted to force into his voice crumbled before forming fully. Elias simply nodded, a gesture that should have eased the tension but instead amplified it, because his control over the moment felt too natural, too effortless, as if the land itself recognized him in a way the riders could not comprehend. One man dismounted, shaking as he admitted he wanted to leave, and when his boots touched the ground, the rest of the gang felt a sharp pull toward retreat. They could no longer fight. The leader shot him a glare meant to regain his authority, but it failed completely when the man refused to meet his eyes, choosing instead to keep his gaze locked on Elias with a mixture of fear and unexpected respect. Elias took a slow breath, letting the wind carry it away, and that simple act forced the leader to finally accept what he had been trying to deny. Taught no trio, no weapon, no number of riders could replace the instinct screaming inside him to turn back while he still had the chance. The horses snorted restlessly, stamping the dirt as if urging their riders to make a choice, and one by one the men began pulling their reins, ready to retreat from a truth they never should have challenged, while Elias stood, unmoving, letting the decision fall entirely into their trembling hands. The leader finally pulled his reins with a defeated exhale, and as his horse turned away, the rest of the riders followed, their retreat slow and shaken. leaving Elias standing alone in the settling dust with the quiet strength of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. And when the valley grew still again, he placed his hand gently over the carved symbol, feeling the warmth of the sun pressed against the wood as if the past he honored was reaching back to him with silent gratitude. The wind carried away the last echoes of hoofbeats, leaving behind a peace he hadn't felt in years. And though his eyes held the weight of old memories, they also carried a calm acceptance that the promise he made long ago had been kept. As he stepped inside his cabin, the land around him seemed to breathe again, knowing its guardian still stood exactly where he was meant to be.